I stood on the porch I once paid for, the gift-wrapped cookies trembling in my hands as the front door clicked shut. Behind the frosted glass, laughter erupted, my grandchildren unwrapping presents I wasn't allowed to give. "We didn't invite you," my son had said, his eyes colder than the December air. "Not even Mom, just you." After raising him, after co-signing the loan that bought this house, after covering the mortgage when he fell behind, I had become an uninvited guest in a home I helped build. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Ellie Grant pressed her hands into the dough, the smell of butter and cinnamon lifting into her small kitchen. Her wrists ached from years of work, but she pushed through, shaping the cookies the way her late husband had always liked. She had wrapped the gifts earlier that morning, tidy corners, ribbons curling just so, stacked neatly in the back seat of her car. It was Christmas, and for the first time in months, she felt a thread of excitement. The drive across the cul-de-sac would be short, but her heart carried the weight of miles. When she pulled into the driveway of 1148 Cedar Lane, the house seemed to glow brighter than she remembered. Lights strung across the eaves blinked in rhythm, and laughter carried through the frosted windows. She hesitated, smoothing her scarf, reminding herself she had every right to be here. After all, it was once her house, the place where she'd raised Mark. She balanced the cookie tin on top of the gifts and walked to the front door, rehearsing the smile she wanted him to see. Inside, the living room was alive with color. Wrapping paper littered across the carpet, the sharp scent of pine from a freshly cut tree, children shrieking with delight as they tore into boxes. Ellie stepped in, her eyes lingering on the walls she had once painted, now covered in framed family portraits where she didn't appear. For a second, she thought maybe Mark would welcome her, maybe the years of distance would soften. Instead, he froze when he saw her. Mark's brow furrowed, his voice slicing through the cheer. "Why are you here?" "We didn't invite you." The words landed heavy, louder than the tearing paper, louder than the TV murmuring in the background. Ellie clutched the gifts tighter, her knuckles whitening. Stephanie, perched elegantly on the couch with a glass of wine, didn't bother to stand. She tilted her head, a thin smirk spreading. "We sent the evict to everyone. Must have missed you." Her tone dripped with satisfaction, as if exclusion had been the gift she wanted Ellie to unwrap. The room quieted, eyes darting between grandmother and son. Ellie's throat constricted. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Instead, she felt the sting of humiliation radiating through her chest, hotter than the wool scarf she'd wrapped around her neck. The cookies, once warm, felt heavy, the foil-wrapped plates bending in her hands. She set them gently on the entryway table, though no one moved to take them. The air buzzed with the sound of children ripping paper again, forced laughter rising to cover the tension. Ellie lingered a moment longer, long enough to see Mark glance past her as though she were an intruder, long enough to feel the invisible hand pushing her back out the door. By the time she slid into her car, her face burned with shame, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. The lights of her old house blinked in the rearview mirror, taunting her with their rhythm. As she drove back to her small rental, the silence inside the car pressed in. Her humiliation simmered into something colder, sharper. Her living room was silent except for the ticking of the old mantel clock, each second tapping like a reminder she wasn't meant to ignore. She walked to the oak desk by the window, the same desk where she had signed countless loan papers in her career, where she'd written tuition checks and balanced budgets when her husband was alive. The bottom drawer stuck a little as she pulled it open, the wood swollen with age. Inside, beneath a stack of utility bills and stationery, rested the manila folder she hadn't touched in years. The label, written in her careful script, glared at her. House, 1148 Cedar Lane. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out, the paper soft and worn from time. It felt heavier than it should, like it carried not just documents, but every compromise she had ever made for her son. The metal clasp gave way with a metallic snap, and suddenly the past spilled across the table. There were photocopies of checks, her signature pressed in firm blue ink. $12,000 here, $5,000 there. The down payment that got them in the door. A bank's carbon copy of the loan cosign. Her name printed in bold letters beneath marks. Mortgage stubs she had quietly covered during the months he claimed he was between jobs, though she later discovered the money went to a new SUV and weekend trips. Ellie brushed her fingertips across the pages, the texture rough against her skin. Each line, each date, each dollar amount came back to her in sharp detail. She remembered the phone calls with bank officers, the late-night calculations at this very table, the trust she had placed in Mark's promises. And tonight, after all of that, he had looked at her like a trespasser. A knock startled her. She hesitated before opening the door, unsure if she wanted company in the middle of her storm. But when she saw Joan Turner standing there, bundled in her oversized coat, holding a bottle of wine by its neck, Ellie felt her shoulders loosen just slightly. "I thought you might need this," Joan said, stepping inside with the confident ease of someone who never needed permission. The cold air clung to her scarf, mixing with the smell of cinnamon cookies still lingering in Ellie's kitchen. Ellie managed a tired smile. "You always know." Joan's eyes dropped to the table, widening at the sight of the papers spread out like a crime scene. Well, that looks serious. Rough Christmas?" Ellie let out a breath that was more of a laugh, though bitter and short. "They told me I wasn't invited." Joan froze, her jaw tightening as if she'd been slapped herself. "What?" Mark looked me in the face and asked why I was there. Stephanie sat smirking on the couch. Like I'd crashed someone else's party, Ellie sank into the chair, her hands resting on the folder like it was an anchor. I left the cookies on their table and walked out. Joan placed the wine bottle on the counter with a solid thunk, pulling off her gloves one finger at a time. Her voice was sharp, almost gleeful in its outrage. "Ungrateful doesn't even cover it. After everything you've done for them," she leaned closer, scanning the rows of documents with practiced eyes. Years in real estate had given Joan a nose for paperwork. Down payment checks, cosign forms, loan records. "Ellie, you practically gift-wrapped that house for them." Ellie stared at the papers. "And tonight, they made sure I knew it wasn't mine." Joan shook her head, tapping one of the forms with her red polished nail. "Then maybe it's time they remember exactly who got them through that door. If they uninvited you from Christmas, maybe you should uninvite them from the house." The words hit Ellie with a strange weight. Not cruel, but undeniable. She had been humiliated. Yes, but now, here in front of her, lay something stronger than shame. Proof. She spread the pages out in straight lines across the table, aligning the edges, her movements slow and deliberate. The silence grew thick, broken only by the crinkle of paper and the pop of Joan finally uncorking the wine. Ellie's breathing steadied. Every document she laid down built a wall of evidence, piece by piece, memory by memory. Then, at the bottom of the pile, she found it. A photocopy of the original deed. She hadn't looked at it in years. The paper was thin, nearly translucent under the kitchen light, but the black letters stood out clear and sharp. She leaned closer, reading line after line until her eyes caught the part she hadn't expected to see. Not just Mark Grant, Eleanor M. Grant, co-owner. The words stared back at her, undeniable, binding. She pressed her finger against her printed name, her pulse quickening. The humiliation from earlier shifted, cooling into something steadier, something that spread through her veins like steel. Joan sipped her wine, watching Ellie's face change. "What is it?" Ellie didn't look up. Her eyes stayed fixed on the page as her lips curved into the faintest smile. "They forgot I'm still on the deed." Joan leaned over her shoulder, the faint scent of her perfume mixing with the dry, papery smell of old documents. "I've seen 100 of these," Joan murmured, her voice low but certain. "You know what that means, right? Mark refinanced. Sure, but he never filed a quitclaim, which means your name was never taken off. Ellie kept staring at the words. Her finger trembled as it traced the line that bound her to the property. So I'm not just some co-signer? Joan straightened, folding her arms with satisfaction. No, honey. You're an owner. As much as he is. The words should have felt like vindication, but they pressed into Ellie with complicated weight. Owner. It was a title she had never stopped feeling, even when she handed Mark the keys, even when she watched them paint the shutters a garish shade of teal. And yet, they had erased her in practice, treating her like a guest in the very house her money had raised from dirt. She stood, her chair scraping against the linoleum. I need to know for sure. Joan tilted her head. Then call. Ellie hesitated, the phone cold in her hand. Memories of her years working as a mortgage officer swirled back. Endless conversations with county clerks, the shuffle of paperwork, the satisfaction of neat signatures. She dialed, each ring hammering louder in her ear until a brisk voice answered. County Recorder's Office. How can I help you? Ellie steadied her breath. Yes, this is Eleanor Grant. I need to confirm ownership on a property. 1148 Cedar Lane, Indianapolis. There was a pause, the sound of keys clacking in the background. Ellie imagined some young clerk, bored on a holiday week, scrolling through records that held the power to change everything. Yes, Mrs. Grant, the clerk said finally. It looks like you and a Mark Grant are both listed as owners. Co-owners. The most recent refinancing didn't change that. Ellie closed her eyes. The words rang louder than the humiliation she'd carried home the night before. Thank you, she whispered, her voice steady now, almost cold. That's all I needed. When she hung up, Joan was watching her closely. Well? Ellie lifted the deed, holding it at eye level like a verdict. Then it's still my house. For a moment, silence filled the kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, the steady tick of the mantel clock slower, as if the house itself was absorbing what had just been spoken. Ellie felt something uncoil inside her. Not relief exactly, but clarity. The humiliation from Christmas night had settled into her bones as shame. Now it reshaped itself into a different energy entirely. Purpose. Joan poured them both glasses of wine, her expression sly. You realize what this means, don't you? Ellie's lips twitched into something between a smile and a grimace. It means they've been laughing in a house that was never entirely theirs. Joan clinked her glass gently against Ellie's. And that mistake? It might be the best Christmas gift they've ever given you later. After Joan left, Ellie sat alone with the folder still open in front of her. She turned the deed over and over, the crisp edges biting against her fingertips. She thought of Mark's face, the arrogance in his eyes as he'd asked why she was there. She thought of Stephanie's smirk, the satisfaction in her dismissal. And now she thought of this, her name, fixed beside his on paper that neither of them could erase with a cruel sentence. The kitchen light buzzed faintly overhead. Ellie reached for her reading glasses, slipping them off as her phone vibrated on the table. She almost ignored it, but the screen lit up with a notification from social media. Against her better judgment, she opened it. There was Mark, grinning at the camera with Stephanie at his side, the Christmas tree glowing behind them. The children sat in front of the fireplace, ribbons and wrapping paper scattered around. The caption beneath the photo cut sharper than any remark he'd made to her face. Our home, our rules. Ellie stared at the words until her jaw ached from clenching. If he thought that house was his kingdom, then he had forgotten something crucial. A queen's name was still written in the stone. The next morning, the winter air cut against her cheeks as she drove to a nondescript strip mall on the south side of Indianapolis. Wedged between a nail salon and a payday loan office was a small law firm with tinted glass windows. The brass plaque read, Cynthia Reynolds, attorney at law. Ellie hesitated before pushing the door open. Inside, the faint smell of stale coffee and carpet cleaner filled the cramped waiting area. A receptionist barely looked up from her computer before nodding toward a closed office door. "She's expecting you, Mrs." Grant Ellie stepped inside. Cynthia Reynolds was nothing like the lawyers Ellie had known during her mortgage years. Mid-40s, sharp-bobbed hair, black blazer unbuttoned just enough to look casual but not careless. Her desk was stacked with case files, but the space radiated control, not chaos. Cynthia gestured to the chair opposite her. "Let's see what you've got." Ellie slid the folder across the desk. Cynthia opened it with the efficiency of someone used to slicing through excuses. She scanned the deed, the checks, the cosign forms, her pen tapping in a steady rhythm as she read. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint hum of traffic outside. Finally, Cynthia leaned back, lips curving into something between a smirk and a smile. "Your son made a rookie mistake. Refinanced without clearing title. He never filed a quitclaim deed, which means..." She tapped the page twice with the pen. "You're not just on the hook. You're still an owner." Ellie sat straighter, her hands clasped in her lap. "I want it fixed." Cynthia studied her a moment, as though weighing whether Ellie wanted repair or fire, fixed or flipped on them. The memory of Stephanie's smirk, Mark's dismissal, and that caption surged all at once. Ellie didn't hesitate. "Flipped." A flicker of approval crossed Cynthia's face. She pulled a legal pad closer, her handwriting swift and slanted. "Then here's how this works. We file a notice of ownership dispute with the county recorder. That puts them on legal notice that this house isn't solely theirs. Once that's filed, every decision they make about the property, mortgage, sale, even renovations, has to pass through you." The words sank in slowly, each one a new weight shifting the balance of power. Ellie pictured Mark's face when the letter arrived, Stephanie's careful world cracking around her. Cynthia continued, her tone brisk. "And if we really want to twist the knife, we don't just stop at notice. We push for partition." Ellie tilted her head. "Partition? Co-owners who can't agree? The court can order the house sold." "Split the proceeds." Cynthia leaned forward, her eyes glinting. "Or one co-owner can buy out the other." The idea tasted sharp and clean, like biting into a winter apple. Ellie imagined walking back through that front door, not as a guest, but as the rightful owner. "Draw it up," Ellie said. Cynthia's pen scratched across the page. "Consider it done." For the first time in days, Ellie felt her chest loosen. She had walked into this office carrying humiliation like a stone. She was leaving with a weapon. As she stood to leave, Cynthia handed her a copy of the draft notice. "Once this is filed, expect noise. They'll panic, then rage, then call you every name they can think of. Don't let it shake you." Ellie nodded, tucking the papers back into the folder. "I've heard worse. This time, I'm not walking away." That evening, back in her quiet kitchen, the phone rang. She recognized the number before she answered. Stephanie's voice came through, cold and clipped. "Why are you stirring things up, Eleanor?" The false politeness couldn't mask the venom underneath. "You'll regret this." Ellie held the phone a second longer, letting the threat hang in the air. Then she set it down gently on the counter, the line still open but her mind already sharpening to steel. They wanted her gone. Instead, she was about to become impossible to ignore. On the morning the notice went out, Ellie was already awake, sipping black coffee at her kitchen table. The sky outside was pale gray, snow dusting the edges of the cul-de-sac. The folder sat open beside her mug, every document aligned, as if even the paper knew its importance. Cynthia had promised the filing would be quick, clean, and devastating. Ellie only had to wait. Across town, the first envelope landed in Mark and Stephanie's mailbox, with the county seal stamped across the front. A second was pushed through the slot in their door. By mid-afternoon, the notification had reached them by email as well. No room for confusion. Property co-owned with Eleanor M. Grant. Stephanie was the first to read it. She stood in the kitchen, her manicured hand gripping the page so tightly the paper wrinkled. The smell of peppermint candles clashed with the metallic tang of her panic. "Mark," she called, her voice sharp. "Come here." He strode in, still in sweatpants, his face flushed from irritation rather than exertion. What now? She thrust the letter at him. He scanned the lines, his expression morphing from boredom to disbelief to fury. His voice cracked into a roar. That's impossible, the letter crumpled in his fist as he slammed it against the counter. She's lying. This has to be some clerical screw-up, but the bold letters didn't vanish. His mother's name stood beside his, anchored in black ink. Back in her quiet home, Ellie felt the vibration of her phone as Cynthia texted. Filed. Notices delivered. Ellie set the phone down, inhaling the steady warmth of her coffee. She wasn't smiling, not yet, but a calmness filled her chest. They could rage all they wanted. The law had already spoken. When Joan stopped by later that afternoon, stomping snow from her boots, she didn't bother with pleasantries. She spotted the gleam in Ellie's eyes and grinned. Well, did it land? Ellie slid the notice across the table, the seal gleaming under the light. Joan let out a low whistle. Oh my. Merry Christmas to you, Eleanor. She raised her glass of water as if it were champagne. And an unhappy New Year to them. Ellie allowed herself the smallest smile, though it carried the weight of years. It's legal, she said simply, her voice even, deliberate. They can scream all they want. My name isn't going anywhere. Meanwhile, at 1148 Cedar Lane, the mood was volcanic. Mark paced the living room, the tree lights blinking mockingly behind him. She won't get away with this. I'll call the bank, the recorder, whoever I need. I'll have it reversed. Stephanie, however, wasn't pacing. She stood at the window, staring out at the cul-de-sac, as though the neighbors already knew. Her reflection in the glass looked pinched, brittle. She turned, her voice low but dripping venom. She wouldn't dare take this public. She wouldn't humiliate her own son. Mark slammed a fist onto the mantel. She's bluffing, but the silence that followed said otherwise. Even Stephanie, for all her bravado, knew bluffing didn't come with stamped notices and recorded filings. The phone rang in Ellie's house that evening, slicing through the calm. She didn't need caller ID to know who it was. She answered anyway. Stephanie's voice slithered through the receiver, tight and sharp. You think this is clever, Eleanor? Stirring things up, dragging us through paperwork? You'll regret this. Ellie's gaze drifted to the folder on her table, to her name etched in black ink, where no smirk or insult could erase it. Her voice came steady, almost gentle. The only thing I regret is not doing this sooner. Stephanie hissed something unintelligible before the line went dead. Ellie set the phone down, the silence returning like a blanket. She reached for her pen, her hand steady now, and opened a fresh notepad. The next morning, Cynthia called, her tone brisk but edged with satisfaction. We're not just confirming ownership, Mrs. Grant, we're filing for partition sale. If they don't settle, the court will order the property sold. Ellie closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. For the first time since Christmas night, she felt something sharp and undeniable rise inside her. Anticipation. The day Cynthia explained partition action, Ellie listened with the cool detachment of someone hearing a verdict already decided in her bones. As a co-owner, you can force a sale, Cynthia said, sliding the legal pad across the desk. The court doesn't care about family dinners, grudges, or captions on Christmas photos. If co-owners don't agree, the judge orders a sale. Simple as that. Ellie traced her finger down the paper, following the neat bullet points Cynthia had written. Petition, notice, hearing, sale. 4 steps. A process that would turn humiliation into reclamation. She thought of Mark's voice. Why are you here? And Stephanie's smirk like victory champagne. Do it, Ellie said. Cynthia arched one eyebrow, almost smiling. Authorize it in writing, and I'll move this. Trained forward, the pen felt heavy in Ellie's hand, but her signature was steady. Eleanor M. Grant. A name Mark had tried to write out of his narrative was now the one line that could dismantle his entire claim. Within days, the notices were mailed. One, official and unflinching, arrived in Mark and Stephanie's mailbox. property at 1148 Cedar Lane subject to partition action. Potential forced sale pending court order. Stephanie was the first to see it. She stood by the granite countertop, a pile of shopping bags at her feet from the mall trip she had just returned from. Her manicure gleamed against the cream-colored envelope as she tore it open. Her eyes scanned, and the blood drained from her face. "No," she whispered. "She wouldn't." Mark stormed in from the garage, wiping grease from his hands. "What now?" Stephanie thrust the paper at him, her voice sharp and brittle. "She's trying to sell the house." "Our house," Mark read, his jaw tightening with every line until he flung the notice onto the counter. "She's bluffing." It's intimidation. She wouldn't actually drag her own son into court. But when Stephanie met his eyes, she saw doubt flicker there. She crossed her arms, her voice low and vicious. "You don't know your mother as well as you think." Back in her own kitchen, Ellie received Cynthia's call. "They'll tell themselves you're bluffing," Cynthia said, her voice crisp with amusement. "That's how most people comfort themselves. But I know you don't bluff." "You file." Ellie didn't respond right away. She stood at her window, staring at the bare trees outside. A cardinal landed on the fence post, red against the winter gray, unbothered by the cold. Finally, she said, "Then let them stew." The papers speak louder than I ever could that weekend. Ellie drove slowly through the cul-de-sac, the tires crunching over patches of ice. She slowed as she passed 1148 Cedar Lane. Stephanie was outside, juggling glossy shopping bags, her designer boots slipping slightly on the walkway. She shouted something to Mark inside, her face twisted with irritation, but Ellie couldn't hear the words. Ellie's gaze lingered on the house, her shutters now teal, her roses ripped out for mulch beds, her dining room window covered with curtains she would never have chosen. Yet despite the changes, she felt no ache this time, only inevitability. 2 days later, a white pickup truck rolled up to the curb. A man in a heavy coat hammered a metal stake into the frozen ground, the sound ringing sharp in the crisp air. He slid the rectangular board into place, tightened the bolts, then stepped back. The sign stood tall at the edge of the yard, its bold black letters impossible to miss. For sale. Pending court order. Neighbors paused as they walked their dogs, whispers curling into the air like smoke. Mark yanked open the blinds, his face pale, his mouth moving in silent curses. Stephanie came rushing to him, the window, her hands clapping over her mouth. The festive wreath still hung on their door, but the sign outside erased any illusion of stability. Ellie watched from her car at the end of the street, her breath fogging the windshield. The sight of the sign sent a jolt through her, not joy exactly, but a deep satisfaction, like a chess player watching the opponent's king cornered. The house they had tried to weaponize against her was now a pawn on the public market. And this was only the beginning. Mark's roar shook the walls of 1148 Cedar Lane. "You can't do this. It's my house." He waved the court notice in the air, his face blotched red, veins rising in his neck. The Christmas tree behind him blinked innocently, its lights flickering in rhythm with his fury. Stephanie hovered near the counter, arms crossed tight, her nails digging crescents into her skin. Her voice broke in a sharp whisper. "Stop yelling! The neighbors will hear." She snatched the paper from him, rereading the bold words. Partition action, court-ordered sale, pending. Her stomach turned. This can't be happening. This can't. Mark slammed his fist onto the counter, rattling the wine glasses in the rack. "She's bluffing!" Mom doesn't have the guts to follow this through, but Ellie, miles away at her own table, listened as Cynthia's calm voice floated through the phone. "It's her house too, Mark. Legally equal. You can shout until your throat gives out, but it won't change the ink on the deed." Ellie sipped her tea, saying nothing. She didn't need to. Cynthia's words carried all the weight. On the other end, Stephanie broke, her voice high and brittle. "What will people think? The neighbors, the HOA, my friends. What will they say when they see a legal notice taped to our door? We'll look pathetic." Ellie finally spoke, her voice even and almost kind. They'll think the truth. Stephanie inhaled sharply, then hung up with a clatter. Joan, who had been listening from Ellie's kitchen counter, chuckled into her wine. You know how fast word moves in this neighborhood? Want me to give it a nudge? Ellie arched a brow. Like you'd wait for permission. By the next morning, whispers rippled through the cul-de-sac. Joan leaned casually over Diane's fence, her tone hushed just enough to sound conspiratorial. Did you hear? A family dispute in the Grants' house. Court-ordered sale? Can you imagine? Diane gasped. After everything Ellie did for them? That's shameful. At brunch 2 days later, Stephanie's nightmare came true. Her circle of friends sipped mimosas, the clink of forks against plates filling the air. But the chatter carried an undercurrent. Whispers, glances, laughter muffled behind napkins. I heard they're losing the house, one murmured, her eyes darting toward Stephanie. Apparently the mother still owns half, another added, her voice syrup-sweet. Wouldn't want that. Blasted online, Stephanie forced a brittle smile, her mimosa untouched, her fingers trembling around the glass. Her curated image, the flawless Christmas cards, the HOA board, the carefully staged dinners, was unraveling, one rumor at a time. Meanwhile, Mark sulked at the bar downtown, whiskey staining his breath. She's 80% responsible for this, he ranted to a friend, slamming the glass down hard enough to rattle the coasters. I'll fight her. She won't dare drag me to court. But his voice lacked conviction, and even his drinking buddy noticed the shadow of fear behind his bluster. Ellie, on the other hand, was steady. She sat at her kitchen table, her pen moving neatly across her calendar. She knew this rhythm well: denial, outrage, panic, collapse. Mark and Stephanie were somewhere in the storm between outrage and panic. Collapse was waiting on the horizon. The call came 3 days later. Cynthia's voice was clipped, efficient, but Ellie could hear the satisfaction beneath it. The judge has set a date for the partition hearing. February 14th. Ellie wrote the date down in her careful script, pressing the pen so firmly it indented the page. Valentine's Day. A day meant for roses and devotion, now repurposed as a day of reckoning. She closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. The Grants thought they were fighting her. They hadn't realized yet. They were already standing in front of a judge. And Ellie knew courtrooms better than most. The courtroom was cold, the kind of cold that didn't come from the air vents, but from the walls themselves, sterile, indifferent, carved from decades of other people's disputes. Ellie sat at the petitioner's table beside Cynthia, her folder of papers resting neatly in front of her like a shield. She smoothed the edge of her blazer, steadying her breath. This wasn't her first courtroom. She had spent years here in different roles, advising clients, watching judges slice through excuses with the flick of a gavel. But today wasn't about work. Today was about her name, her house, her son. Mark and Stephanie entered late, as though swagger could make up for tardiness. Mark wore a suit that didn't quite fit, his tie askew. Stephanie clung to his arm, her lips pursed, a scarf draped dramatically around her shoulders. They looked less like defendants and more like actors auditioning for sympathy. When the judge called the case, Mark sprang first, his voice rising before he had even taken the stand. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. My mother gave us the down payment as a gift. That was her choice. He glanced back at the gallery, where a few neighbors sat, curious. Now she's trying to take it back. The judge, a graying man with sharp eyes, lifted a hand. Mr. Grant, you'll speak when asked. Sit down. Mark's jaw tightened as he obeyed, slumping into the chair beside Stephanie. Cynthia rose smoothly, her navy suit crisp, her voice cutting, like glass. Your Honor, we have evidence to the contrary. She lifted the first exhibit, a series of canceled checks. Each bore Ellie's signature in blue ink. Across the memo line, in Ellie's meticulous handwriting, were the words, Loan, repayable. The clerk passed them to the judge. He adjusted his glasses, reading silently for a moment before setting them down. Not a gift, then, he murmured. Mark shot up again, unable to stay quiet. She wrote that later. You don't know my mother. She's manipulative. Ellie's hands folded calmly in her lap. She didn't look at him, didn't let his words graze her. When it was her turn to testify, she stood, the wood of the witness stand cool beneath her palms. Her voice was steady, low but firm. I co-signed the loan. I covered payments when Mark fell behind. I never surrendered ownership. I trusted him, yes, but I never signed away my rights. Her words filled the room, not loud but immovable. She saw the judge's eyes narrow in quiet approval. Stephanie shifted in her seat, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Your Honor, she whispered, her voice fragile. This has been so hard on our children. All we've ever wanted is stability. To take their home away, it would break them. Her tears glistened, but they felt rehearsed, her gaze darting toward the gallery to check her audience. The judge's face didn't soften. Mrs. Grant, children's feelings aren't relevant to property law. Please stay on point. Cynthia didn't give Stephanie room to continue. She lifted another stack of papers, mortgage payment records. The crisp sound of the stapled packet hitting the judge's bench echoed through the chamber. Here are the defaults. And here, she tapped the highlighted lines, are the payments Mrs. Grant made directly from her account to cover them. Mark sank lower in his seat. His cheeks flushed crimson, his fists clenching in his lap. The judge leaned back, his tone decisive now. The evidence is clear. Mrs. Grant retains full co-ownership rights. Unless this family can reach a private settlement, the law requires the property to be sold and the proceeds divided. A hush fell. The gavel hadn't even struck yet, but the ruling hung heavy, final. Ellie felt her chest loosen, not with joy but with something sharper. Validation. She had come armed with documents, and they had spoken louder than Mark's excuses, louder than Stephanie's theatrics. The judge wrote the next steps into the record. Partition sale authorized. Court will oversee proceedings unless agreement is reached voluntarily. He looked at Mark, then at Ellie. Settle if you can. Otherwise, this house is going on the block. Ellie lowered herself back into her seat, the weight of years pressing into her spine, but her shoulders straightened. The house wasn't theirs anymore, not in spirit, not in image, not even in paperwork. It was now a matter of survival. And Ellie knew exactly how to turn survival into victory. The courtroom was still buzzing after the judge's ruling. Mark slouched in his chair, his jaw locked tight, while Stephanie dabbed at her eyes again, more conscious of the audience than the verdict. Ellie sat straighter, her folder closed now, the documents no longer necessary. She had won recognition, but recognition wasn't enough. She wanted something tangible, something permanent. Cynthia leaned in close, her voice low but cutting. We don't have to let it go to public sale. You can buy them out instead of selling. Ellie's eyes narrowed. The words struck like a match. Buy them out, Cynthia nodded, slipping a form across the desk. You have equal rights. The court allows either party to purchase the other's share if funds are proven. You wouldn't be walking away with half the money. You'd be walking away with the whole house. Ellie's heart thudded, but her face stayed calm. She thought of the teal shutters, the laughter that had excluded her, the caption on Mark's smug holiday post. She thought of Christmas mornings past when her late husband had strung the lights, when Mark was still small enough to run down the hallway in footy pajamas. That house had never belonged to Mark alone. It had always been theirs. Her voice came out steady. That's what I want. Mark jerked upright, incredulous laughter spilling from him like he'd just heard a bad joke. You? You can't afford it, his scoff echoed against the wooden benches. You live in a rental, for God's sake. You're retired. You barely make ends meet. Ellie didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her tote bag and pulled out a thick binder. Its leather edges were worn from years of use, the pages stuffed with tabs, notes, bank slips. She laid it on the table, unzipped it, and flipped to a page marked in red. Rows of numbers gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Savings accounts, CDs, a tidy retirement fund she had been quietly feeding for over a decade. Statements, all neatly organized. Proof of deposits dating back years. Mark's laughter faltered. Stephanie leaned forward, squinting at the columns as if the numbers might dissolve if she looked hard enough. No, this isn't. Her voice wavered. She turned to Mark, desperate. She can't actually. Joan, seated in the back row, let out a dry chuckle that carried across the courtroom. Told you she plays long games. Cynthia slid the binder closer to the judge. Proof of funds, Your Honor. My client is fully prepared to buy out the respondent's share within the court's timeline. The judge thumbed through the pages, his expression giving nothing away. He set the binder down carefully. Mrs. Grant, you understand this means transferring funds equal to the fair market value of your son's share? Ellie lifted her chin, her voice unwavering. I understand. Mark shoved back his chair, the scrape loud and ugly. She's bluffing. She's trying to humiliate us. This is some stunt, Stephanie hissed, her composure cracking into desperation. Judge, you can't just let her. This is our home. Our children's home. But the judge didn't flinch. He tapped his pen against the bench, his tone clipped and final. The law provides both parties equal rights. If Mrs. Grant can make payment within the set period, ownership will transfer to her. If not, the sale proceeds as ordered. Mark shook his head, muttering under his breath. Stephanie sat frozen, her hands twisting in her lap. Ellie sat still as stone, her breathing even. The weight of the courtroom pressed in on all of them, but only she seemed untouched by it. She had been underestimated for too long, treated as fragile, irrelevant, disposable, but now she was the one holding the ledger, the one dictating the terms. The judge looked down at the papers once more, then spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the hushed room. The court approves the buyout. Payment due in full within 30 days. The gavel struck once, sharp and resonant. Ellie closed her binder with a soft snap, the sound somehow louder than Mark's outbursts or Stephanie's protests. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply slid the binder back into her bag, her movements precise, controlled. Mark's voice finally broke the silence. 30 days! You'll choke on it. You'll never make it happen. Ellie turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. Her expression was unreadable, but her words carried the weight of decades of sacrifice. Watch me. The bank lobby smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet, the kind of place where silence felt permanent. Ellie sat across from the financial officer, her binder resting on the table between them. Numbers mattered here, and numbers had always been her language. She tapped one page with her finger. That's the account. Transfer in full. No delays. The officer adjusted his tie, glancing nervously at the amount on the screen. Mrs. Grant, are you sure? This is a significant withdrawal. Ellie met his eyes, her voice calm. I've been sure for 30 years. Execute the transfer. The click of the keyboard was crisp, final. A line of digits vanished from her retirement account and reappeared on the court's escrow ledger. Ellie exhaled slowly, her breath fogging slightly in the cold air of the office. She had spent a lifetime saving, budgeting, cutting corners when no one noticed. Today, every quiet choice she'd made had bloomed into power. When she returned to Cynthia's office, the attorney already had the court paperwork spread out like a map of victory. Cynthia's red pen scratched across the page, her voice steady. Funds confirmed. We'll finalize with the clerk this afternoon. Ellie nodded, her expression composed. But beneath her stillness, she felt the subtle thrum of anticipation. Across town, Mark and Stephanie sat in their living room, the blinds drawn tight as though the outside world were poisonous. Mark's hands shook as he scrolled through his phone, searching for some loophole, some savior article about contesting a buyout. This is insane, he shouted, flinging the phone onto the couch. She can't just take the house out from under us. Stephanie sat stiffly, arms folded, her voice brittle. Where are we supposed to live, Mark? Do you even have a plan? Her words cut deeper than she intended. For the first time, the arrogance in his posture faltered. He didn't answer. That same afternoon, the clerk, At the county courthouse, slid the stamped documents across the counter toward Cynthia. The woman's nails clicked lightly against the wood as she double-checked the signatures. Transfer approved. Ownership transferred to Eleanor Grant. Cynthia smiled faintly, a small but sharp curve of satisfaction. She turned to Ellie. It's official. It's yours. Ellie picked up the papers, her fingertips brushing the embossed seal. Her name stood alone now, unchallenged, unmoved. Eleanor M. Grant, sole owner. She tucked the pages into her binder, the sound of the zipper sealing them away like treasure locked in a chest. Mark and Stephanie found out later that evening. Another letter from the court arrived, thick with stamped confirmation. Mark tore it open at the kitchen counter, his face draining of color as he read the words. His hands shook so violently the page rattled. Stephanie hovered close, her voice a thin wire of panic. Tell me it doesn't say what I think it says. Mark slammed the paper onto the counter, his voice breaking. It says it's hers. It's all hers. The silence between them was raw, thick with dread. Stephanie sank into a chair, her hand pressed to her forehead. What do we tell the kids? She whispered. Mark didn't answer. His pride had built a fortress out of that house, and Ellie had toppled it with nothing more than patience and paper. Later that night, Ellie drove slowly through the cul-de-sac, headlights gliding over the familiar row of mailboxes. She slowed as she neared 1148 Cedar Lane. The curtains were drawn, but the faint glow of lamplight spilled through the cracks. Outside, the driveway was cluttered with cardboard boxes, some collapsed, some hastily taped. A stack of flattened moving cartons leaned against the garage. Stephanie appeared in the doorway, her hair tied back messily, a box in her arms. Mark followed behind, his face hard but hollow, carrying another load to the car. Their silhouettes moved like shadows through the light, strained and weary. Ellie didn't roll down her window, didn't announce herself. She only watched, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, the documents safe in her passenger seat. The house they had claimed as theirs was already spitting them out, and she hadn't even walked back through the front door yet. The cul-de-sac had always been the stage for Mark and Stephanie's performances. Gleaming cars in the driveway, over-the-top Halloween displays, a new patio furniture set every spring. They never missed a chance to remind the neighborhood that the Grants' house was the jewel of Cedar Lane. But within days of the court's decision, the performance collapsed. It was Joan who made sure the story traveled with speed and precision. She carried a grocery bag in one arm and the news in the other, leaning over Diane's picket fence. Did you hear? Joan's tone was soft but electric, the kind of whisper meant to be passed, and along Ellie bought them out of their own house. Court approved. Her name's the only one on the deed now. Diane's eyes widened, her garden gloves frozen midair. After everything she paid for them? Ungrateful kids. Imagine treating your own mother like that. By evening, 3 other households had the same version of the story, each detail polished and sharpened as it spread. Soon, whispers became knowing glances whenever Mark and Stephanie pulled into the driveway. Curtains twitched, heads shook. At the next HOA meeting, Stephanie tried to hold her ground. She arrived in her usual blazer, notes in hand, determined to keep her seat on the board. But when budget discussions turned to property disputes, someone coughed pointedly, another member shifted uncomfortably, then asked, should someone in the middle of losing their home really be making decisions for the neighborhood? The words landed like a gavel. Stephanie's face stiffened. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. By the end of the night, she was off the board, voted out with polite smiles and downward glances. The humiliation bled into every corner of her life. Brunches that once included her name on the invite list now forgot. Group chats went silent. At the school pickup line, other mothers offered curt nods, but no conversation. Her carefully constructed image cracked, one icy whisper at a time. Mark handled it differently. He drowned his bitterness in bourbon at a local dive bar on the edge of town. The smell of fryer oil and stale beer clung to the air as he slouched at the counter, his face shadowed. To anyone who would listen, he ranted. "You don't get it," she blindsided us. "Who sues their own son? What kind of mother does that?" He slammed his glass down, amber liquid sloshing over his hand. But even the regulars stopped responding after a while, their polite nods fading into silence. His voice echoed into emptiness, the sound of a man unraveling in plain sight. While they sulked and sputtered, Ellie moved differently. She baked. The smell of apple and cinnamon drifted from her kitchen, filling her house with warmth. She carried pies across the cul-de-sac, smiling as she handed them to neighbors who welcomed her at the door. Each pie wasn't just dessert, it was proof. She wasn't the bitter recluse Stephanie had painted her to be. She was kind, steady, generous, and now undeniably in control. At Diane's house, Joan sliced into one of Ellie's pies, the steam curling up sweet and spiced. She took a bite, her eyes closing in satisfaction. "Justice," she said around the flaky crust. "Tastes sweeter when it's baked." Ellie laughed softly, the sound carrying through the living room. The humiliation of that Christmas night had transformed into something else entirely. Community, support, quiet vindication. She didn't need to gloat. The neighborhood did it for her, but Stephanie wasn't finished. That evening, in the dim glow of her laptop screen, she typed furiously into a postbox on social media. Her nails clacked against the keys, each word laced with venom. "We were robbed by a bitter old woman who couldn't let go of the past." She hit publish with a triumphant jab, her face hard in the glow of the screen. For the first time in weeks, she smiled. Stephanie's post spread quickly, her words sharp enough to cut but vague enough to bait curiosity. "We were robbed by a bitter old woman who couldn't let go of the past." Screenshots made their way into neighborhood chats, whispers reignited, and the comment section swelled with pity and speculation. Some neighbors clicked like without thinking, while others responded with cautious sympathy. Ellie didn't respond right away. She never had been one to rush when patience could do more damage. Instead, she took a screenshot of the post, time-stamped and saved. Then she printed it, sliding the page into her ever-growing folder. Paper over pixels, her language, her strength. The next morning, she walked into Cynthia's office, the smell of strong coffee filling the air. She laid the printout across the attorney's desk. "She thinks the internet will protect her." Cynthia raised an eyebrow, her expression equal parts irritation and delight. "Bad move. False statements, public platform, direct attack on reputation." She tapped her pen against the words. "That's defamation. And in Indiana, that's actionable." Ellie sat quietly, her hands folded. "Draft the letter." By noon, Stephanie's inbox held a crisp cease and desist, complete with court letterhead and Cynthia's signature. The language was sharp as glass. Retract or face lawsuit. There was no wiggle room, no gray area to hide behind. When Stephanie opened it, she went pale. She sat at the kitchen table, phone clutched in one hand, the letter trembling in the other. Mark hovered nearby, his voice brittle. "Ignore it." "She's bluffing again." Stephanie shook her head violently. "No, this is different. It's official. They'll drag us through court again. We can't afford it." Her fingers shook as she reopened her laptop. With a few stiff keystrokes, the post vanished, deleted, gone like it had never existed. But not erased, not from Ellie's file, because Ellie had already emailed the screenshots to Cynthia. "Add it to the record," she wrote simply. Evidence was never wasted. That evening, Joan stopped by with her usual grin, carrying a casserole under one arm. She spotted the printed post on Ellie's counter and let out a low laugh. She forgot who she was dealing with. "You worked with judges for 30 years, Ellie smirked, sliding the page back into the folder. "I never forgot how to file evidence." They ate quietly at Ellie's kitchen table, steam curling up from the casserole, the smell of cheese and herbs filling the room. Outside, snow drifted down, softening the cul-de-sac. Inside, Ellie's confidence solidified. Every time Stephanie tried to twist the story, Ellie had documentation sharper than any insult. Across town, Mark sat silent on the couch, a beer in his hand, the TV flickering light across his face. He didn't rant this time, didn't roar, just stared, hollow and bitter, while Stephanie pouted beside him, her eyes glued to her phone. Without the post, her narrative had collapsed. Without the house, her image had cracked. She scrolled through her feeds, searching for sympathy, but found only silence. Ellie leaned back in her chair, the folder resting like a fortress on the counter. She had turned their lies into evidence, their arrogance into ammunition, and she wasn't finished. The phone rang late that night. Ellie answered, her voice calm, though her pulse quickened at the sound of the county clerk's measured tone. "Mrs. Grant, I wanted to inform you. The deed has been finalized. Your name is now listed as the sole owner of 1148 Cedar Lane." Clean and clear, Ellie closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. For the first time in months, she let her shoulders sink. The weight of proof and humiliation lifted at last. She whispered her thanks, hung up, and placed the receiver gently back in its cradle. The house was hers, not just in memory, not just in spirit. On paper, sealed, undeniable. And soon, Mark and Stephanie would understand what it meant to be outsiders looking in. The deed came in a heavy envelope, its edges crisp, the paper embossed with the county seal. Ellie slid it open with a letter opener, her hand steady despite the electricity humming through her veins. She unfolded the document slowly, as though savoring the weight of each line until her eyes landed on the words that changed everything. Eleanor M. Grant, sole owner. Cynthia's voice echoed through the speakerphone on the counter. "It's official. You are the only owner now." Clean and clear, Ellie pressed her palm flat against the page, her throat tightening. The house was no longer tied to a son who disowned her or a daughter-in-law who sneered. It was hers, legally, permanently, without loopholes. For once, she allowed herself to smile. That evening, she posted a single photo online. Not of her face, not of her furniture, just her hand, aged but steady, holding a silver ring of keys against the backdrop of the cedar-paneled door. Her caption was brief. "Home again." It was enough. Within hours, comments flooded beneath it. Neighbors cheered, friends clapped back with words like congratulations and justice. But on the other side of town, Stephanie scrolled through the same post with eyes wide, her nails tapping furiously against her phone. Her own followers, people she once dazzled with perfectly staged holiday tables and curated snapshots of our dream home, mocked her in the comments. "Guess all those HOA lectures didn't save you." So it was her house all along? Ungrateful much. Stephanie threw her phone onto the couch, her face burning. "They're laughing at me," she hissed. Mark sat in the recliner, a bottle of whiskey open at his side, his shirt wrinkled and collar loose. His anger had dulled into something heavier, defeat. "Then stop reading," he muttered, though his own eyes were red-rimmed from scrolling through the same humiliation. The weeks that followed were marked with boxes, tape, and whispered arguments that slipped through the thin walls of 1148 Cedar Lane. Furniture Stephanie had bragged about online was dismantled, their curated Christmas ornaments stuffed into storage bins without care. The smell of cardboard and dust replaced the once persistent cinnamon candles. Finally, on a damp April afternoon, Mark showed up at Ellie's rental. He looked older than his years. His shoulders slumped as though gravity had doubled its pull. For a moment, Ellie saw the boy he used to be, the child who once asked for one more bedtime story. But then he spoke, and the illusion shattered. "Mom, please, just let us stay until summer. The kids need time. School doesn't end until June." His voice cracked at the edges, but pride kept it from breaking completely. Ellie stood in the doorway, her hand resting on the frame. Her eyes softened for a flicker, then hardened again. "You told me I wasn't invited." "Neither are you." Mark's mouth opened, but no words came. His eyes darted to the floor, then back to hers, searching for mercy. None came. By the end of the week, the cul-de-sac buzzed with motion. Moving trucks pulled into the driveway, their engines growling as men in work gloves carried out the remnants of Stephanie's curated life. Mattresses wrapped in plastic, sofas tilted sideways through the door, boxes labeled fragile stacked carelessly in the truck bed. Stephanie stood on the curb, her sunglasses hiding little of the redness around her eyes. She tried to bark orders at the movers, but her voice lacked conviction. Mark lingered by the garage, stuffing tools into a bin, his face a mask of exhaustion. From a distance, Ellie watched, parked at the edge of the street. The sight wasn't joyful, but it was necessary. The house was purging them, box by box, memory by memory. The same house where they had uninvited her at Christmas was now uninviting them for good. And the last of their boxes hadn't even been hauled away yet. The first night she walked back into 1148 Cedar Lane alone, the house was hollow, stripped of the lives that had mocked her within its walls. The air smelled of cardboard and dust, a faint echo of the perfume Stephanie once sprayed to mask every surface. Ellie stood in the entryway, keys in her hand, the silence pressing against her ears. She closed the door softly, almost reverently, and leaned her forehead against it. Then she climbed the stairs. The carpet was worn, the railing smooth beneath her hand. Unchanged since the years she had climbed them half asleep, carrying laundry baskets or listening for the sound of her boy's footsteps. She opened the door to the master bedroom. The smell of fresh paint lingered from a shade she'd never have chosen, but underneath it, faint and familiar, was cedar from the old closet. She drew a deep breath and let it fill her. For the first time in years, she felt at home. The next morning, she set out her paintbrushes and cans in the dining room. The teal paint Stephanie had chosen glared back at her under the morning sun. Ellie dipped her brush into her own color, a rich cream that warmed under the light. Each stroke erased the teal like a cleansing, each layer reclaiming what had been stolen. The smell of fresh paint wrapped around her, sharp but hopeful, until the walls looked the way they should have all along. Joan appeared that afternoon, knocking once before barging in, carrying a bottle of champagne with a ribbon still tied to its neck. She looked around, her eyes bright. "To your homecoming," she said, lifting the bottle like a trophy. Ellie laughed softly, taking the bottle from her. "It feels different, empty, but mine." "Empty's good," Joan said, her voice matter of fact. "Empty means you get to fill it the way you want." Over the next week, Ellie did just that. She brewed coffee in the kitchen and invited neighbors who had once been kept at arm's length by Stephanie's cold hospitality. The smell of fresh grounds mingled with cinnamon rolls baking in the oven. Diane sat at the table, her voice warm. "It feels like this house finally belongs on this street again." Laughter filled the dining room, echoing off the walls that now wore Ellie's color. One morning, Cynthia stopped by, her heels clicking against the hardwood, her sharp eyes scanning the freshly painted walls. She accepted a mug of coffee, leaning against the counter. "That was surgical," she said, her tone almost admiring. "Most people slash and burn. You filed, you documented, you cut them down with precision." Ellie's lips curved. "I don't swing axes," she said, her voice low but steady. "I pull deeds." Cynthia laughed softly, raising her cup. "And you pulled this one perfectly." The days passed with quiet rituals of reclamation. Ellie unpacked her old quilts, smoothed them over her bed, and opened the curtains wide to let in the morning light. She planted fresh roses where Stephanie had torn them out, the soil damp and rich beneath her gloves. She polished the wooden banister until it gleamed. Every detail was a thread sewn back into place, every corner of the house whispering its welcome. But the neighborhood didn't just watch. They leaned in. Handwritten notes slid through her mail slot. "Welcome back, Ellie." Invitations began appearing in her mailbox. Block parties, coffee mornings, dinners. She had gone from being excluded to being sought after, her name once erased, now inked at the top of lists. Ellie smiled as she pinned each invitation on the corkboard in her kitchen. One after another, the stack grew. Thanksgiving dinner, neighborhood wine tasting, a 4th of July barbecue, and finally, Christmas. She paused at the stack of red and green envelopes. Each was addressed warmly, inviting her back into homes that had always seemed closed. But not one bore her son's handwriting. A year had passed, but the memory of that Christmas still flickered sharp in Ellie's chest. Only now it no longer burned. It glowed. The house at 1148 Cedar Lane was hers again. And this December, every room carried the warmth of her choosing. The tree stood tall in the front window, its branches trimmed with gold ribbons and ornaments collected over decades. Glass baubles caught the light, casting small glimmers onto the walls. From the street, passers-by slowed their steps, children tugging at parents' hands to admire the glow. Neighbors waved through the frosted glass, their smiles genuine, not polite. Ellie knelt carefully, her knees pressing into the soft rug as she slid gifts beneath the tree. Each was wrapped in her style, edges sharp, ribbons curling into precise spirals. None bore her son's name. None needed to. The tags read, to Joan, to Diane, to Cynthia, to the Reynolds kids, and even to the mail carrier. Gifts for people who saw her, who welcomed her, who treated her with dignity. The scent of roasted ham filled the air, mingling with cloves and cinnamon sticks simmering in cider on the stove. Joan stood at the dining room table, carving the ham with theatrical precision, shaking her head when anyone offered to help. "I've been waiting a year for this meal," she announced, her grin wide. Cynthia, dressed down for once in a soft sweater instead of a blazer, poured steaming cider into mugs. She handed one to Ellie with a small toast. To precision, to patience. To deeds, Ellie clinked her mug against hers, laughter spilling easily now, unforced. The sound filled the room, echoing off walls that had once known silence and exclusion. Around her table, chairs were full. Neighbors leaned in close, voices rising and falling in warm harmony. The clatter of forks against plates blended with the hum of conversation. The house, her house, was alive again, and this time with people who wanted her there. Ellie leaned back in her chair, soaking in the glow of candlelight, the hum of voices, the scent of pine and roasted meat. The humiliation she had carried from that first Christmas was gone. In its place was something steadier, richer, peace earned, justice sealed. Outside, the cul-de-sac lay quiet beneath a soft dusting of snow. A car slowed as it passed the glowing house. Mark sat behind the wheel, his eyes fixed on the window. The sight of laughter, of warmth he no longer had access to, pressed against the glass like a ghost. Stephanie's shadow moved in the passenger seat, her face turned away. Neither of them waved. Ellie noticed, but she didn't rise, didn't frown, didn't waver. She only reached across the table for another slice of ham, her laughter ringing out as Joan teased Cynthia about her lawyer handwriting on the place cards. The house was full again, and this time it was full of choice. Later, when the fire burned low and the last guest lingered, Ellie stood by the window. She looked out at the quiet cul-de-sac, the tree glowing behind her like a beacon. She thought of that night a year ago, standing at this same door with gifts in her arms, being told she wasn't wanted. The words no longer stung. They had become the spark that lit her path back here. She whispered to herself, steady and certain. "At Christmas," my son said. "Why are you here?" So I took back the house they opened gifts in.